March 1943. North Atlantic, 400 miles southwest of Iceland. Through the periscope of U-456, Kapitänleutnant Max Teichert observed something that contradicted everything German naval intelligence had promised about American industrial weakness. Convoy HX-229 stretched beyond the horizon, 58 merchant vessels in perfect formation, and this was just one of 3 massive convoys crossing simultaneously. The ships bore unusual welding marks instead of rivets, suggesting construction methods that defied traditional shipbuilding. Where the Kriegsmarine's intelligence service had assured U-boat commanders that America could build perhaps 200 ships per year, Teichert was witnessing evidence of something far more disturbing. The convoy moved with mechanical precision, each vessel maintaining perfect station despite mounting seas. Teichert counted the columns again, unable to believe his eyes. These weren't the rusty tramp steamers and aged cargo vessels that intelligence had predicted would comprise American convoys. These ships appeared new, their hulls showing identical construction patterns, their superstructures matching like products from a factory line. The escort screen was equally impressive: destroyers, corvettes, and what appeared to be a small aircraft carrier, its flight deck visible even at periscope depth. September 1939. When World War II erupted across Europe, Germany's U-boat fleet numbered 57 submarines, though only 27 were suitable for Atlantic operations. Naval intelligence reports from the German embassy in Washington had shaped strategic planning at the Kriegsmarine's headquarters in Berlin. American shipyards, the reports claimed, still used riveting techniques from the Great War. Skilled shipbuilders were scarce. Building a single cargo vessel required 8 to 10 months. The United States possessed only 7 yards capable of constructing ocean-going vessels. These assessments formed the foundation of Admiral Karl Dönitz's tonnage war strategy. German naval attachés in Washington had spent years compiling detailed reports on American shipbuilding capacity. Their observations, based on visits to civilian shipyards and conversations with American naval officers at social functions, painted a picture of an industry mired in outdated practices. The New York Shipbuilding Corporation, they noted, took 11 months to complete a single cargo vessel. The Federal Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company in New Jersey employed traditional riveting methods unchanged since 1918. Even the modern yards in Newport News moved with what was described as typical American lethargy, taking nearly a year to complete merchant vessels. These reports shaped the fundamental assumptions of German naval strategy. If America entered the war, the Kriegsmarine calculated, its shipbuilding industry would require at least 2 years to convert to wartime production. Even then, the shortage of skilled workers would limit output to perhaps 300 vessels annually, a figure that could be managed by an expanded U-boat fleet. The arithmetic of the tonnage war seemed favorable. If Germany could sink 700,000 tons of Allied shipping monthly, while limiting Allied shipbuilding to 500,000 tons per month, Britain would be starved into submission within 2 years. The calculation assumed American shipyards operated like German ones, where skilled craftsmen spent months carefully constructing each vessel. The possibility that ships could be mass-produced like automobiles never entered German strategic planning. Korvettenkapitän Günther Hessler, Dönitz's son-in-law and chief operations officer, had developed these calculations with methodical precision. A former surface fleet officer who had transferred to the U-boat arm, Hessler brought systematic analysis to naval warfare. After France fell in June 1940, U-boat headquarters moved to Kernevel near Lorient on the French Atlantic coast. In a requisitioned chateau, Hessler established an operations room that resembled a corporate accounting office more than a military command center. Charts covered every wall, marked with colored pins representing U-boats, convoys, and sinkings. Filing cabinets contained detailed records of every merchant ship sunk, its tonnage carefully recorded and added to running totals. Hessler had calculated that each U-boat needed to sink 100,000 tons before being lost to maintain a favorable exchange rate. If Germany could maintain a 3-to-1 replacement ratio for submarines while the Allies struggled to replace merchant losses, victory was certain. The early war seemed to validate these calculations. The first happy time of 1940 to 1941 saw German U-boats sinking Allied shipping faster than Britain could replace it. U-boat aces like Otto Kretschmer, Joachim Schepke and Günther Prien became national heroes, their tonnage tallies celebrated in German newspapers. Kretschmer alone sank 44 ships totaling 266,629 tons. The numbers appeared to favour Germany. December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor brought America fully into the war, triggering what U-boat commanders would call the second happy time. Within days, Dönitz had dispatched 5 long-range Type 9 submarines to American waters under Operation Drumbeat, Paukenschlag. In January 1942, Kapitänleutnant Reinhard Hardigan, commanding U-123, arrived off New York Harbor to find a situation that exceeded German intelligence's most optimistic assessments. American coastal defenses were virtually non-existent. Merchant ships sailed independently with navigation lights blazing, their radio operators chattering openly about positions and cargoes. Coastal cities remained fully illuminated, their glow silhouetting passing vessels for submarine attack. Hardigan could hardly believe his good fortune. On his first patrol alone, he sank 9 ships totaling over 53,000 tons. His war diary contains almost giddy entries about the ease of operations. It is almost too easy. The Americans sail as if in peacetime. Their lights guide us to them like beacons. In 6 months, German submarines sank nearly 600 ships totaling over 3 million tons along the American coast. U-boat commanders reported scenes of incredible prosperity even as they attacked. Through their periscopes, they observed coastal highways packed with automobiles, cities blazing with electric lights, and beaches where civilians continued their peacetime recreation, seemingly oblivious to the war offshore. The Americans seemed not just unprepared, but almost indifferent to the submarine threat. Yet as German submarines celebrated their success, something unprecedented was taking shape in American shipyards. In December 1940, a California construction magnate named Henry Kaiser had signed a contract to build 30 cargo ships for Britain. Kaiser was 60 years old, a high school dropout who had built roads, dams and bridges, but never a ship. His previous projects included the Hoover Dam, the Grand Coulee Dam, and the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge. What German intelligence failed to detect was Kaiser's revolutionary approach to industrial problems. Kaiser didn't think like a shipbuilder because he wasn't one. Where traditional shipbuilders saw a ship as a unique creation requiring careful craftsmanship, Kaiser saw it as an assembly of components that could be mass-produced. Where shipbuilders worked from the keel up with one crew, Kaiser envisioned multiple crews building sections simultaneously. Where shipbuilders relied on skilled workers with years of training, Kaiser believed he could train anyone to do specific tasks quickly. Traditional shipyards built vessels from the keel up, with one crew performing all tasks in sequence. A ship would sit on the ways for months as workers slowly added each component. Skilled riveters, a trade that required years to master, would painstakingly join plates with hundreds of thousands of rivets. The process hadn't changed significantly since the age of sail gave way to steam. Kaiser approached the problem differently. Instead of thinking vertically, he thought horizontally, adapting Detroit's automotive methods to ship construction. Ships would be built in modular sections constructed simultaneously in different parts of the yard, then brought together and welded. Welding, not riveting, would join the plates, a faster process that required less skill to master. This method violated centuries of shipbuilding tradition, but promised unprecedented speed. The transformation began at Kaiser's Richmond, California shipyards, built on mudflats on San Francisco Bay. Where once there had been empty marshland, Kaiser constructed 4 separate shipyards employing 90,000 workers by early 1942. These weren't traditional shipyard workers. Kaiser recruited farm laborers from Oklahoma, shop clerks from Kansas, housewives from California. Anyone who could learn, Kaiser believed, could build ships. The training programs Kaiser established would have horrified traditional shipbuilders. Workers learned one specific task: how to weld a particular seam, operate a specific crane, or install a certain component. They didn't need to understand the entire ship, just their piece of it. A housewife who had never held a welding torch could be welding hull plates within 3 weeks. A farmer who had only driven a tractor could be operating a massive crane within days. By early 1942, Kaiser's 4. Richmond yards were operating 3 shifts, 24 hours daily. The yards never stopped, never slowed. Under massive floodlights that turned night into day, workers assembled ships with mechanical efficiency. The noise was deafening. Welding torches, rivet guns, cranes and machinery creating a cacophony that could be heard miles away. The first Liberty ship, SS Patrick Henry, launched on September 27, 1941, had taken 244 days to build. Roosevelt himself attended the launching, declaring that this class of emergency cargo vessels would bring liberty to Europe. By mid-1942, construction time had dropped to 70 days. By late 1942, Kaiser's yards were completing ships in under 45 days. The improvement curve was exponential, each vessel teaching lessons that accelerated the next. The secret lay not just in Kaiser's methods, but in his approach to problems. When told there weren't enough skilled welders, he created training programs that produced welders in weeks. When steel deliveries slowed, he built his own steel mill. When workers couldn't find housing, he built entire cities for them. Vanport, Oregon, constructed to house Kaiser shipyard workers, became the nation's largest wartime housing project with 40,000 residents, spring 1942. German naval intelligence began receiving disturbing reports from neutral observers in American ports. Spanish diplomats counted dozens of new ships in New York Harbor, all bearing recent construction dates. The Spanish naval attaché in New York, Capitán de Navío Juan Cárdenas, reported to his German counterpart that he had personally observed 43 newly constructed vessels in a single week of March 1942. His report, forwarded to Berlin through Madrid, was annotated with a skeptical note. Verify through additional sources. Numbers seem inflated. Japanese naval attachés, still actively gathering intelligence despite being interned after Pearl Harbor, managed to smuggle out reports through diplomatic channels. Commander Toshikazu Omae, assistant naval attaché in Washington before internment, reported shipyards operating under lights so bright that night became day. His report described scenes that seemed impossible. Workers change shifts without pause in production. As one man steps away from welding position, another takes his place immediately. The welding arc never stops. Swedish merchant captains, whose ships still called at American ports, described harbors transformed into industrial cities. Captain Erik Nordahl of the MS Kungsholm reported in April 1942, Baltimore harbor unrecognizable from last year. Where 6 ships might anchor, now 30 crowd together. New vessels arrive not weekly but daily. All bear signs of recent construction. Fresh paint, no rust, builder's marks still visible. At U-boat headquarters in Kernavell, these reports were systematically dismissed as Allied disinformation. Hessler annotated one Spanish report with his precise handwriting, propaganda, physical impossibility. No nation can produce ships at this rate. The German naval attaché in Madrid was formally reprimanded for forwarding obviously false observations without proper verification. A message from naval intelligence in Berlin stated firmly, reports of American shipbuilding must be verified against known industrial capacity. Fantastic claims undermine intelligence credibility. The institutional blindness was rooted in German experience. The Wehrmacht had achieved miracles of production in tanks and aircraft, but these were relatively small items that could be mass-produced in factories. Ships were different, massive, complex, requiring skilled labor and time. The battleship Bismarck had taken 3 years to build. Even a simple cargo vessel in German yards required 8 months. The idea that Americans could build similar vessels in weeks was literally inconceivable. The first U-boat commanders to witness the reality were those operating off the American coast in early 1942. Kapitänleutnant Horst Degen, commanding U-701, surfaced after a night attack off Cape Hatteras to assess remaining targets. Through his Zeiss binoculars, he observed ships bearing fresh paint with no weathering despite being mid-Atlantic. Hull numbers showed construction dates only weeks old. Some vessels still displayed shipyard chalk markings indicating recent inspections. Degen's war diary entry for April 15, 1942, captured his confusion. Observed convoy of 12 merchants heading north. At least 8 appear to be recent construction based on paint condition and uniform design. Hull numbers suggest building dates within past 2 months. How is this possible? Our intelligence reports American capacity at 20 ships monthly maximum. I observe 8 new ships in single convoy. Oberleutnant zur See Herbert Werner, serving as watch officer on U-230, recorded similar observations during patrols off the American coast. The ships appeared identical, down to deck crane placement and lifeboat positions. Hull numbers painted on their sides showed construction dates impossibly close together. Ships supposedly built months apart looked like they had rolled off a production line within days of each other. Werner's personal diary, which he kept hidden from his superiors, contained increasingly worried entries. May 20th, 1942, counted 20 ships in convoy SC-85. All appear to be same class, same construction, like counting automobiles of same model. Intelligence insists Americans build each ship individually. What I observe suggests mass production. If true, our calculations are worthless. The reality exceeded their worst fears. By late 1942, building a Liberty ship required less than 50 days and 500,000 labour hours. In Kaiser's most efficient yards, it approached 300,000 labour hours. But the speed improvement was just part of the story. American shipyards had developed prefabrication into an industrial art form. Hull sections were built in factories hundreds of miles inland, transported by rail, and assembled at coastal yards. The double bottom of a Liberty ship might be constructed in Denver, shipped by train to Richmond, and welded to a bow section built in Sacramento and a stern fabricated in Los Angeles. Parts for a single ship might be manufactured in 30 different states, converging at the final assembly point. The scale of this distributed production network was beyond German comprehension. A Liberty ship required 250,000 different parts. In German practice, most of these would be manufactured at or near the shipyard. In American practice, they were produced wherever capacity existed. A factory that had made refrigerators now produced watertight doors. A plant that had built automobiles now manufactured deck winches. The entire American industrial base had been mobilized for shipbuilding. November 1942 brought a demonstration that should have shattered any remaining illusions. At Kaiser's Richmond shipyard, workers assembled the Liberty ship SS Robert E. Peary in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. While this was admittedly a publicity stunt with extensive preparation, not standard production, it demonstrated capabilities German observers could barely process. The Peary had been carefully planned as a morale-building exercise. Components were pre-positioned, workers rehearsed their tasks, and everything was optimized for speed. The keel was laid at 1 minute past midnight on November 8, 1942. By the morning of November 12th, the ship was ready for launching. Mrs. Peary, widow of the Arctic explorer, christened the vessel before a crowd of thousands of shipyard workers and dignitaries. When news of the Peary's construction reached U-boat headquarters through Swiss newspapers, Dönitz himself declared it fabrication. "Propaganda of the clumsiest sort," he reportedly told his staff. "They count only final assembly, not component construction. Or perhaps they launched an empty hull. No ship can be built in 4 days." But German agents in neutral countries were beginning to report disturbing confirmations. The Portuguese consul in San Francisco, who maintained friendly relations with German diplomats, confirmed that he had personally witnessed the Peary's launching. Swedish businessmen reported seeing American newspapers with photographic proof of the construction sequence. Even allowing for exaggeration, something extraordinary was happening in American shipyards. The truth was more disturbing than even this record suggested. The Peary was just the most extreme example of systematic acceleration in American shipbuilding. By December 1942, Liberty ships were being completed at an average rate of 42 days from keel laying to delivery. This included not just hull construction, but complete fitting out with engines, navigation equipment, crew quarters, and cargo handling gear. German intelligence officers struggled to verify reports that seemed to describe industrial fantasy. American shipyards employed 50,000 workers in 1939, building perhaps 24 ships annually. By late 1942, employment exceeded 700,000. By mid-1943, it would peak at nearly 1.7 million workers. Each worker produced 3 times the tonnage per hour of their German counterparts, despite most having no prior shipbuilding experience. The workforce itself defied German expectations. Women comprised nearly 20% of shipyard workers by 1943. African Americans, whom Nazi ideology dismissed as inferior, operated complex machinery and supervised construction teams. Mexican Americans, Chinese Americans, and Native Americans all contributed to the shipbuilding effort. The workforce that German racial theory claimed could never cooperate was outproducing the racially pure German workforce by orders of magnitude. May 1943 became Black May for the U-boat force. 41 submarines were lost, nearly a quarter of the operational fleet. The causes were multiple: improved Allied convoy escorts, better radar, aircraft coverage, and breaking of German naval codes. But the strategic implications went deeper than tactical defeats. Even if the U-boats had maintained their early success rate, the tonnage war no longer worked. Confirmation came through intelligence that could no longer be denied. 3 Liberty ships were being completed every single day, not launched, not laid down, but completed and delivered ready for service. The United States was producing more merchant tonnage monthly than the entire pre-war German merchant marine. The tonnage war's fundamental premise, that sinkings could exceed construction, had become impossible. Kapitänleutnant Peter Kremer, commanding U-333, reviewed aerial reconnaissance photographs that represented enormous risk to obtain. A long-range Focke-Wulf FW-200 Condor, flying at the extreme limit of its range from a base in Norway, had photographed New York Harbor. The images were grainy but clear enough to count ships. Comparing photographs taken 3 weeks apart, Kremer identified 43 vessels that hadn't existed in the first image. The implications were staggering. If New York alone could accumulate 40 ships in 3 weeks, and America had dozens of major ports, the total production must be in the hundreds per month. Even if every U-boat achieved maximum potential, perhaps 100,000 tons per patrol, the entire fleet couldn't match American construction. The psychological impact manifested in patrol reports that grew increasingly fatalistic. Convoy sizes that seemed impossible in 1941 became routine by 1943. Kapitänleutnant Werner Henke of U-515 encountered convoy UGS-15 off West Africa. Approximately 90 merchant vessels in 15 columns, attacked at night, sank 2 ships totaling 14,000 tons. Negligible impact. Convoy continued without slowing or altering course. The U-boat war diary for March 1943 contained stark admissions that were carefully hidden from crews. Even if submarine operations returned to peak efficiency of early 1942, the tonnage war was lost. America had already built more ships than U-boats could sink, even with unlimited torpedoes and 0 losses. The fundamental strategy had failed. By mid-1943, intelligence confirmed American shipyards weren't limited to Liberty ships. Victory ships, larger and faster, were entering production using the same techniques. These vessels could make 16 knots compared to the Liberty ships' 11, fast enough to outrun surfaced U-boats. T-2 tankers, desperately needed to fuel the Allied war effort, rolled off ways every 3 days. The entire naval expansion used similar principles. The Victory ship program represented an evolution of lessons learned from Liberty ship construction. Where Liberty ships were built to a British design adapted for American production, Victory ships were designed from the outset for mass production. They were larger at 455 feet versus 441 feet, faster with turbine engines versus reciprocating engines, and more sophisticated in construction. Yet they were being built nearly as quickly as Liberty ships. Fregattenkapitän Eberhard Gott, compiling statistics for Dönitz, discovered patterns that defied belief. American shipyards had expanded from 7 ocean-capable facilities in 1939 to over 50 by 1943. New yards rose from empty ground to full production in 4 months. The Bethlehem Fairfield shipyard in Baltimore, which hadn't existed in 1940, was by 1943 producing a ship every 10 days with 47,000 workers operating around the clock. The workforce statistics were equally stunning. The 1.7 million shipyard workers of 1943 included 400,000 women, Rosie the riveters, who had become welders. African American workers, barred from most shipyards before the war, now comprised up to 30% of the workforce in some yards. The barriers of gender and race that German ideology considered immutable had dissolved in the heat of American industrial mobilization. Reports reaching Berlin described scenes that seemed to mock German austerity. Shipyard parking lots filled with workers' private automobiles, thousands of them, more cars than most German cities possessed. Cafeterias serving meat at every meal, fresh vegetables, milk and ice cream. Medical clinics providing free health care including dental services. Childcare centres allowing mothers to work shifts while their children were educated and fed. The workers defeating Germany lived better than German officers fighting the war. They earned wages that would have seemed fantastic in Germany, up to $1.20 per hour for skilled welders, more than a German submarine officer's daily pay. They lived in new housing developments with electricity, running water and modern appliances. They sent their children to free public schools and could afford to buy war bonds with surplus income. June 1943 marked the effective end of the Battle of the Atlantic. Dönitz withdrew U-boats from the North Atlantic, tacitly admitting defeat. Wolfpack operations against convoys, which had been the cornerstone of German naval strategy, were no longer sustainable. U-boats were being sunk faster than they could be replaced, while Allied shipping expanded exponentially. But intelligence reports continued describing American production that exceeded all previous estimates. The 10,000th vessel of the emergency shipbuilding program launched in September 1943, less than 3 years after the program began. To put this in perspective, the entire German merchant marine in 1939 comprised about 4,500 vessels. America had built twice Germany's entire pre-war merchant fleet and was still accelerating production. U-boat commanders described a futility that transcended military defeat. Kapitänleutnant Robert Kaiser of U-177, attacking convoy HX-239 in July 1943, wrote, "Over 70 ships visible through periscope, expended all torpedoes, sank 3 vessels, approximately 21,000 tons. Convoy proceeded unchanged. Escort commander didn't even signal general alarm. We are fighting industrial power, not ships." The Liberty ships themselves became symbols of American industrial philosophy: functional over beautiful, quantity over perfection, standardization over customization. They represented everything German military tradition disdained. German naval officers, trained to appreciate the elegant lines of warships, found the Liberty ships aggressively ugly. Their blunt bows, slab sides, and utilitarian superstructures offended maritime aesthetics. Yet their simplicity was their strength. Every Liberty ship was essentially identical, meaning any shipyard could build them, any crew could sail them, and any port could repair them. Parts were interchangeable between ships. A damaged Liberty ship could be cannibalized to repair others. They were designed to be expendable. If a Liberty ship made one successful voyage delivering supplies, it had justified its construction cost. German observers who obtained shipyard publications through neutral sources discovered revelations that stunned them. Worker newsletters discussed production goals casually, as if building 10,000 ships was merely an ambitious but achievable target. One Kaiser newsletter from Richmond mentioned that the 4 yards had launched more tonnage in 18 months than the entire Japanese merchant marine. Another celebrated the yard's 100,000th worker, a grandmother from Oklahoma who had learned welding in 2 weeks. Intelligence reports grew increasingly surreal as 1943 progressed. American shipyards consumed electricity with abandon that seemed insane to Germans accustomed to blackouts and power rationing. The Kaiser Richmond yards alone used more electricity than the city of Hamburg. Single welding shops consumed more power than entire German factories. The yards blazed with light 24 hours a day, visible from miles away, almost daring U-boats to attack. The production statistics became numbing in their scale. By autumn 1943, American shipyards were launching a major vessel every 10 hours. Not just Liberty ships, but victory ships, tankers, military transports, and specialized vessels. The Maritime Commission was running out of names for ships, having exhausted American counties, cities, and historical figures. They began naming ships after obscure pioneers and forgotten politicians. Convoys grew to sizes that defied tactical doctrine. Convoy HX-264 in November consisted of 79 merchants plus 31 escorts, totaling over 1 million tons of shipping, more than U-boats had sunk in the previous 6 months combined. Individual submarine attacks had become meaningless gestures. German naval intelligence's desperate attempts to analyze American production methods revealed a philosophical gulf between the two nations. Americans built ships accepting that some would fail. Welding defects, engine problems, structural issues, all were acceptable if the overall production met targets. If 10% had defects, build 20% extra. This violated every principle of German engineering perfectionism, but achieved overwhelming numerical superiority. The German tradition demanded that every weld be perfect, every rivet precisely placed, every component machined to exact specifications. A German shipyard would spend weeks ensuring perfection in details that American yards completed in hours. The Americans accepted good enough as a standard, knowing that quantity would overcome any quality deficiencies. December 1943. The U-boat force war diary contained admissions never shared with crews. American shipbuilding exceeds 2 million tons monthly. Even if we could return to early 1942 success rates, we would need 4 U-boats for every one currently operational to match American construction. Tonnage war is unwinnable. This strategic shift from merchant to military targets represented complete admission of failure. The U-boat force that had entered the war to strangle British supply lines was reduced to hoping for lucky strikes against warships. The fundamental premise, that commerce raiding could win the war, was abandoned. The transformation in morale was complete by early 1944. Veterans who had entered the war as confident hunters now undertook missions they knew were futile. Young commanders fresh from training were told privately by experienced officers that survival, not tonnage, was now the measure of success. The tonnage kings, who had been celebrated in 1940 to 1941, were mostly dead, their methods obsolete against improved Allied defences. Intelligence reports from early 1944 described American achievements that mocked German efforts. While Germany struggled to maintain 50 operational U-boats in the Atlantic, America celebrated its 3,000th Liberty ship. The launch was attended by Hollywood celebrities, broadcast on radio, and featured in newsreels shown in American theaters. The workers were treated as heroes equivalent to combat soldiers. Most psychologically devastating were reports about shipyard workers' lives. They earned more than German officers. Skilled welders could make $50 to $60 per week, more than a U-boat commander's monthly pay. They lived in suburban houses with electric refrigerators, washing machines, and telephones. They drove private automobiles to work, owned radios and record players, and could afford vacations. Spring 1944 brought convoy battles that demonstrated the futility of continued operations. Convoy HX-300 crossed with 65 vessels totaling over 800,000 tons. Its escorts included 2 escort carriers launching continuous air patrols, 15 destroyers with advanced centimetric radar that could detect periscopes at 2 miles, and 24 corvettes specifically designed for anti-submarine warfare. The convoy crossed without loss despite attacks by 6 U-boats. German efforts to disrupt American production through sabotage proved pathetically inadequate. Operation Pastorius, landing 8 German saboteurs on American beaches in June 1942, had targeted shipyards among other industrial facilities. All 8 were captured within 2 weeks, accomplishing nothing. 4 were executed, the others imprisoned. The FBI reported that shipyard security was so comprehensive that infiltration was virtually impossible. The Abwehr tried spreading rumors about Liberty ship defects, hoping to create fear among merchant sailors. When some Liberty ships did experience hull cracks in cold water, a genuine problem related to welding techniques, German intelligence attempted to exaggerate the issue. They spread stories of ships breaking in half, crews refusing to sail, and massive losses covered up by censorship. The American response was characteristic. Instead of denying the problem, they studied it, identified the cause, brittle fracture in welds at low temperatures, and modified their welding procedures. Within months, new techniques were implemented across all shipyards. Production never slowed. The Americans treated engineering problems as puzzles to solve, not catastrophes to fear. By summer 1944, U-boat patrol reports no longer mentioned strategic impact or tonnage wars. They simply recorded attacks against increasingly impossible odds. Convoys exceeding 100 ships were becoming common. Individual submarines carried 14 torpedoes, perhaps 24 if they could reload from a supply submarine. Against convoys of such size, even expending all torpedoes affected less than 2% of the convoy's tonnage. Kapitänleutnant Hans-Günther Brosin, commanding U-256, captured the futility in his final patrol report. Attacked convoy ONS-18, 112 merchants, 43 escorts including 3 escort carriers. Continuous air cover. Managed 1 submerged attack, fired 4 torpedoes, claimed 1 hit on 7,000-ton freighter. Depth charged for 14 hours. Survived by miracle. Impact on convoy, negligible. The final German naval intelligence report on American shipbuilding, compiled as the Third Reich collapsed in April 1945, admitted total miscalculation. America had produced more tonnage in 1944 alone, over 11 million tons, than Germany had sunk in 6 years of war. The projection showed that if production continued at current rates, America would possess more merchant shipping than the rest of the world combined by 1946. The report's appendix contained a bitter admission. Intelligence failure regarding American industrial capacity represents the greatest strategic miscalculation in German naval history. We prepared to fight the America of 1918 and encountered instead an industrial phenomenon without historical precedent. Every assumption about shipbuilding limitations proved wrong by orders of magnitude. Admiral Karl Dönitz's final assessment, written in his cell at Nuremberg, acknowledged the fundamental error. We based our entire naval strategy on the principle of sinking ships faster than they could be replaced. We calculated that 700,000 tons monthly would exceed Allied replacement capacity. We failed to imagine that any nation could build ships by the thousands, treating them as expendable items rather than precious resources. The tonnage war was lost not in combat at sea, but in American shipyards where production exceeded our ability to destroy. U-boat commanders' testimony reveals consistent psychological transformation. Men who began the war convinced of German technical and racial superiority ended it in awe of American industrial democracy. They had witnessed something beyond their ideological comprehension, a multicultural society mobilizing its diverse population to achieve impossible production goals through wages and patriotism rather than coercion. Kapitänleutnant Erich Topp, one of the few ace commanders to survive the war, reflected in a 1960 interview, "We discovered there were 2 completely different approaches to warfare, the European tradition of careful calculation and resource conservation, and the American approach of overwhelming production and acceptable waste. They could afford to lose ships because they built them faster than we could possibly sink them. They could waste material because they had unlimited supplies. We were fighting scarcity while they were managing abundance. The emergency shipbuilding program produced nearly 6,000 vessels by war's end, including 2,710 Liberty ships, 534 Victory ships, hundreds of tankers, and military auxiliaries. The Liberty ships alone totaled over 29 million deadweight tons. German U-boats sank 2,825 Allied merchants totaling approximately 11 million tons throughout the entire war. America alone had built nearly 5 times the tonnage that Germany had destroyed globally. But the numbers only tell part of the story. The psychological impact transcended military defeat. U-boat commanders had witnessed a form of warfare that made their entire military tradition obsolete. Individual heroism, tactical excellence, and superior training meant nothing against an enemy who could simply outproduce any conceivable losses. The submarine that took months to build and years to properly crew could be negated by ships built in weeks by workers trained in days. The haunting image for U-boat veterans wasn't the depth charges that pursued them or the aircraft that bombed them, but those endless convoys of identical Liberty ships, ugly and functional, welded rather than riveted, painted in dull grey rather than maritime colours, they represented American pragmatism triumphing over German perfectionism. They were not beautiful vessels like the passenger liners Germany had converted to auxiliary cruisers, nor impressive like the battleships that had consumed German naval budgets. They were simply efficient, produced in quantities that made their individual destruction irrelevant. The U-boat force that had entered the war as Germany's most technologically advanced and professionally trained service ended it demonstrating that technology and training could be overwhelmed by sheer production. The nation that could produce the most would prevail, regardless of tactical brilliance or operational excellence. The lesson was as simple as it was profound. In modern industrial warfare, production capacity had become the ultimate weapon, more powerful than any submarine, torpedo, or naval tactic ever devised. In those endless convoys of utilitarian Liberty ships, German submariners witnessed not just vessels but the future of warfare itself, industrial, systematic, and overwhelming. They had brought excellence to an industrial fight, and lost before they even understood what kind of war they were truly fighting. The Battle of the Atlantic, supposed to be won through courage and tactical skill, had instead been decided in American factories and shipyards where ordinary workers accomplished the extraordinary through the simple act of building faster than the enemy could destroy,